some of the more fascinating pieces of evidence in South America have come out recently about these channels and pathways that they've found in the Amazon.
There is a stretch of the Amazon that does not appear on any tourist map, does not appear in any travel advisory, and until recently barely appeared in any satellite database at all. Brazilian authorities quietly restricted the airspace above it in the early 2000s. Officially, the reason given was turbulence, violent, unpredictable storm cells that made low-altitude flights too dangerous to permit. Pilots who flew nearby described sudden downdrafts, compass drift, and radio interference that never showed up in any weather model. For almost 2 decades, the region sat untouched, a green blank spot bigger than several European countries combined. Then in 2021, a small joint research team secured one of the only permits ever issued to survey it, not by landing, but by flying above it with light detection and ranging equipment, the same laser mapping technology that had already rewritten the history books on lost cities in Guatemala and Cambodia. Nobody expected the Amazon to give up a secret that large. They were wrong. The idea for the expedition began almost by accident. A geologist named Dr. Marisol Types, a specialist in soil composition rather than archaeology, had been studying satellite imagery of unusually dark, fertile patches of Earth scattered through the restricted zone. These patches, known to soil scientists as anthropogenic dark Earth, only formed through centuries of deliberate human cultivation. Wild jungle soil is thin, acidic, and nutrient-poor. It cannot sustain the kind of rich black earth Marisol was seeing from orbit. Something, or someone, had engineered that ground a very long time ago. She brought her data to a small multinational research consortium, and within a year, a joint Brazilian-Canadian survey team had assembled, an anthropologist, a structural engineer, an atmospheric scientist to monitor the strange storm activity, and a young paleoclimatologist named Tomas Reyes, who would end up writing the field notes that later leaked online and inspired half the internet's fascination with this place. The LiDAR flights began in the dry season, when cloud cover was lowest. For the first several passes, the data showed exactly what everyone expected: unbroken canopy, winding rivers, the occasional natural clearing. Then, on the 4th flight, something changed. As the laser returns were processed and the digital canopy was stripped away layer by layer, straight lines began to emerge on the technician's screens. Not the gentle curves of a riverbed or the scattered clearings left by fallen trees, but geometry. Long avenues running for kilometers, intersecting at deliberate angles, opening into wide rectangular plazas. Someone in the command tent that night described it as watching a buried skeleton rise up through fog. By the time the full survey was stitched together, the team was staring at the outline of a settlement stretching across roughly 25 square miles, causeways, residential mounds, water management canals, and at the exact geometric center of it all, a raised platform ringed by a near-perfect circular depression in the terrain. What made the discovery remarkable wasn't just its size, though the site would eventually prove to be one of the largest pre-Columbian settlements ever mapped in the Amazon basin. It was the age. Preliminary charcoal samples pulled from soil cores near the settlement's edge dated to roughly 12,000 years before present, pushing the origins of organized Amazonian society back further than almost any accepted timeline allowed. The scientific literature had long assumed the deep rainforest was too hostile, too resource-poor, to support anything beyond small, mobile bands of hunter-gatherers before the last few thousand years. This settlement, if the dates held up, predated the pyramids of Egypt by more than 7,000 years. It predated Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, long considered one of the oldest deliberately constructed sites on Earth, by roughly a millennium. The central platform was the team's first ground target. Getting there took 9 days of hacking through undergrowth so dense that machetes dulled within hours and had to be resharpened by firelight each night. Tomas Reyes described the jungle in his notes as less like walking through a forest and more like pushing through a living wall that closes behind you the moment you pass. The heat did not relent even after sunset. Insects swarmed in numbers thick enough to blur vision. Twice, the team had to reroute around flash floods that appeared with almost no warning, consistent with the strange storm patterns that had kept the region off limits for so long. When they finally reached the coordinates the LiDAR had marked, they found a low limestone ridge rising out of the canopy, its base wrapped in thick moss and root systems that had clearly grown undisturbed for a very long time. It was the engineer, a soft-spoken Brazilian named Helena Duarte, who first noticed the discoloration. Clearing moss from a section of the ridge to check the stone's structural integrity, she uncovered a patch of red pigment far too vivid and too deliberate to be a mineral stain. Within an hour, the team had cleared enough surface area to realize they were looking at a mural, not a few scattered handprints, which are common enough at ancient sites across South America, but a continuous painted composition stretching nearly 90 feet across the rock face. The detail was extraordinary. Individual musculature was visible on the painted animals. Herds were rendered mid-stride, captured with an accuracy that suggested the artists had studied their subjects closely and repeatedly. The animals themselves were the second shock. None of them were species that exist today. The team identified what appeared to be a giant ground sloth, its silhouette unmistakable even in ochre paint, alongside a herd of gomphotheres, elephant-like animals that vanished from South America roughly 10,000 years ago. If the identification held, and later peer review would broadly support it, the mural had to have been painted by people who had actually observed these animals alive. That placed the artwork squarely at the tail end of the Pleistocene epoch, the same era, responsible for the settlement's foundation layers. Pigment analysis, conducted back at a field lab in Manaus later, confirmed something equally strange. The red ochre used in the painting did not match any mineral source within 250 miles of the site. Whoever created this mural was either traveling extraordinary distances to gather materials, or trading with people who were. But the composition of the mural was what unsettled the team most. Every animal depicted was in motion, fleeing in the same direction, rendered with a kind of urgency that suggested panic rather than a peaceful hunting scene. At the center of the stampede stood a single human figure, arms raised, beneath a cluster of painted dots arranged in a pattern that seemed too deliberate to be decorative. Dr. Amaran Wosu, the team's atmospheric and archaeoastronomy consultant, spent 2 full days photographing and mapping the dot cluster before running it through star chart reconstruction software. Her conclusion, presented quietly around the campfire on the 11th night of the expedition, was that the pattern closely matched the constellations visible from that latitude roughly 12,800 years ago, placing it squarely within the window scientists associate with the Younger Dryas, an abrupt and still not fully explained cooling period that reshaped the planet's climate and coincided with a mass extinction of large mammals across multiple continents. If the mural was a record of that event, it was not a celebration. It was a warning, painted by people who understood, in whatever framework their culture provided, that their world was ending. The path from the mural led the team along the base of the ridge, following a section of exposed rock that Helena Duarte flagged as structurally anomalous. The surface here was smoother than the surrounding stone, coated in a hard, glassy mineral crust unlike anything naturally occurring in that geology. A portable ground-penetrating radar unit revealed a cavity behind the crust, a chamber sealed from the outside by what appeared to be an intense, localized heat event. Whatever had fused that opening shut had done so with enough force to partially vitrify the surrounding limestone, turning the rock's outer surface into something closer to natural glass. Cutting through it was slow, deliberate work. Diamond-tipped drill bits, chosen specifically because standard tools had failed in earlier test cuts on similar material samples, wore down far faster than expected. It took the team the better part of 3 days to open a passage wide enough for a person to fit through. When the seal finally broke, a rush of pressurized air escaped from inside. Not the stagnant, decayed smell one might expect from a sealed cave, but something closer to ozone, the sharp mineral scent that lingers after a lightning strike. Helena, who went in first with a headlamp and a handheld gas sensor to check for dangerous air pockets, later said the smell alone made the hair on her arms stand up before she'd even seen what was inside. The chamber beyond the seal was not a natural cave. The floor had been deliberately leveled and covered in a dark, nutrient-rich soil that matched the anthropogenic dark earth doctor types had first spotted from orbit. the same engineered soil scattered across the broader settlement above. Finding it here, inside a sealed underground space, suggested this had never been a burial chamber or a simple shelter. It had been built and maintained, at least for a time, as something closer to a controlled environment. The chamber's scale became apparent as the team's headlamps swept across it. The ceiling rose nearly 30 feet overhead, reinforced along its length by columns of dense volcanic stone that had clearly been transported from elsewhere. Nothing in the immediate geology matched the material. Deeper in, the passage opened into a wide central room where the team encountered the discovery that would dominate every conversation for the rest of the expedition. Along both walls, large curved bones had been set into the earth in careful symmetrical arcs, forming a kind of vaulted archway the team would later walk beneath to reach the chamber's far end. Testing confirmed what the mural had already suggested. These were the remains of gomphotheres, arranged not as refuse or as the debris of a meal, but with obvious, intentional design. Someone had transported these massive skeletal remains through dense jungle terrain into a sealed underground space, and assembled them with a precision that implied purpose beyond simple storage. At the center of the chamber, the floor dipped into a shallow, circular basin filled with a dark, still liquid. Later lab analysis would describe it as a saturated mineral solution, rich in dissolved charcoal and trace metals, with properties that closely mimicked a low-oxygen preservation environment. Floating within it, remarkably intact after millennia, were seeds. Doctor types whose entire career had been built on the chemistry of ancient Amazonian soils spent nearly an hour crouched at the edge of that basin without speaking. Genetic testing conducted months later on a small sample identified several seed varieties with no living modern equivalent, plants that, as far as the botanical record shows, no longer exist anywhere on Earth. Ceramic containers were found along the chamber's rear wall, sealed with a hardened resin that had kept their contents remarkably stable. Some held more seeds. Others contained what appeared to be dried plant tissue, possibly medicinal or agricultural in origin, though degradation made precise identification difficult even with modern equipment. Taken together, the basin and the sealed jars painted a picture that was hard to avoid. This had been built deliberately and with considerable effort as a repository, a place meant to outlast whatever crisis its builders were preparing for. That crisis left its own physical signature on the chamber's far wall, where a thick layer of dark residue coated the stone. Analysis identified it as blast residue, containing microscopic glass spherules, tiny beads of melted and rapidly resolidified rock that form only under conditions of extreme, sudden heat, the kind associated with major impact events or airbursts. Their presence here, deep within a sealed chamber far from any known volcanic source, lent physical weight to the mural above and to the broader, long-debated hypothesis that a major cosmic impact event